Tim, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today, man. So glad we could finally make this happen. We talked back when you first hopped on Instagram when this was all brand new, and it's since skyrocketed into some exciting things. So thank you, man. If you could tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Jeff. I appreciate it. My name is Tim. I'm the creator of the New Evangelicals. It's a social media account and online community committed to sharing our stories, pushing the church forward, and centered on Jesus. I started it in December of 2020. And it's been quite the ride ever since. So it's not the oldest thing on the books, but it's been around for a couple months now, and we'll see where it goes, but it's been very encouraging to have the traction that it has gotten. So it's been great.
Yeah, it definitely has gotten a lot of traction. So this episode comprises the second half of our week focusing on the concept of deconstruction. Earlier in the week, we talked with Kate Boyd about destigmatizing the term deconstruction and what it actually means. But Tim, you have a story that seems to be more prevalent as others share their stories about hard relationships with the church, like Kate and like others, especially the evangelical church. So I think it'd be good to start off if you could share your story with us, however much you want or don't want to share, and kind of what led you to create the New Evangelicals community.
Well, that's kind of the interesting thing, Jeff, is that I think some people have this misconception that, I was church hurt and then started the New Evangelicals, but that isn't the case at all. I was in evangelical circles my whole life. I was homeschooled for 9 years, grew up pretty reformed / fundamentalist, kind of like a John MacArthur approach. Was always a good kid, did all the mission trips, was always interested in Jesus, did summers missions in my local area through different parachurch organizations. I played music in the church. You can see the drum set behind me. I mean, I got my start drumming professionally in the church. Always been fascinated with Jesus, always been a committed Christian, always did things the quote unquote right way. I mean, my wife and I waited till we got married, and we did everything the right way by evangelical standards. And I've always been interested in trying to follow Jesus better. I mean, that has always been my foundational core identity from as long as I can remember, is just, I want to be a faithful Jesus person, whatever that looks like. So, that's kind of my foundational upbringing. I had a very overall positive church experience. Like I said, I grew up in it. I was in it. I've been in all kinds of evangelical spaces, CMA, Christian Missionary Alliance. I've been in the AG, been in the non-denominational space, been in the Baptist space. I've been around it. And I loved it. So, starting the New Evangelicals was not started out of a place of hurt or even out of anger. It was started because over time, and we can fill in a lot of these blanks, but over time, I realized that the faith I was claiming to follow, this way of Jesus, seemed farther and farther away from this evangelical church space that I was in, with how they were talking politically, with how they were talking even theologically, with how they were talking regarding church structures. So I started the New Evangelicals, honestly, because I was frustrated with Sean Foyt, the worship leader. He was the guy who got me really started on this idea. It was during COVID that I'm sitting home, I'm watching Sean Foyt do these, maskless worship gatherings. Could not understand for the life of me, why are we making this a big deal? And I was just so frustrated. You have to imagine too, this is after Ahmaud Arbery, this is after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and seeing the white evangelical churches overwhelmingly mute response. I mean, yes, there was a pop-up of we should talk about this stuff, but that's all in the past now, and so seeing that kind of happen, and then seeing, of course, Trump, all these things kind of compounded. And I said, something is just so wrong. And I said, we need like a new evangelical movement. And that's what gave me the idea of the New Evangelicals. But I was up until May of this year, and I remember I started the New Evangelicals in December. So this is like several months after I was in evangelical spaces serving faithfully. So my preference was to stay in the evangelical space and kind of show people that some spaces, some churches do things well in the evangelical space. That isn't what happened, and we can get into that. But the foundation of why I started this was not, oh, the church hurt me. Oh, I've been kicked out of the church. Now I'm going to start this online thing. Quite the opposite. I started it because I thought we really have to push the church forward. And I'm a part of this church, and I'm a part of the evangelical movement. That is my mother, and we have to push for better and for deeper theology, etc. So that's kind of like some of the story there of how I kind of got involved with this space. But it was not birthed out of, I've been personally hurt by church. I've actually had, again, until recently, pretty good church experiences.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. Now, as you talk through that and thinking about seeing your posts and everything, that kind of connects. I'm starting to remember that. But kind of, as you said, even recently with a lot of uptick with things that you've brought up regarding Mark Driscoll, regarding, fill in the blank. There's a lot of different things to bring up in the news, in the evangelical space. I would love to know, as a worship leader, how many times you heard someone say, "Daddy God." Like,
I've been fortunate. I've only heard it like a handful of times.
Okay.
Most people in my spaces were not dropping that abhorrent line. But I've heard it more than once in my life.
Yeah. Okay. I just had to think about that. I think I saw something about that today. I'm like, I'm going to ask Tim about that. So yeah, thank you, man. So one thing that I've personally struggled with regarding deconstruction, kind of where to start engaging people well in it. So I'm a youth pastor. And so, and this next question I'm going to give, as you've seen, it's a huge question, but it's basically the foundation for our discussion. And there's a lot of different ways we can go. So as far as engaging people well, which I do think is the root of why you even started what you're doing. You want to, part of how you like represent it is you want to engage people well and listen and hear, and not just say, here's what you should do. Right.
Yeah.
So Tim, in your experience so far, probably specifically with new evangelicals, I think people that are deconstructing and sharing about it online, they just want to vent and not hear from anyone unless they're encouraging them and cheering them on. Are they just hurt and need time before they engage? Or do they actually want to engage, but maybe with certain unwritten terms and conditions as far as what that looks like? Or is it a big question mark?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, yes to all.
Yeah.
Right. I think there are certainly layers, and every person's different. Every person has a different story. Yes, there's definitely some similarities in a lot. I see a lot of themes. I think it's important for your audience to know that for me and for our community, deconstruction, I realize it's a very broad term. We define it as re-examining the things that you were taught were absolute truths in Christianity. Okay. So it's like things that you were taught were non-negotiable. You're starting to rethink a little bit. And that could be things that maybe you thought were always negotiable, but for someone else, they weren't. Like, for example, a literal 6-day creation. A lot of people were taught that's a non-negotiable. If you believe in evolution, you're just, one step away from atheism. Right, so deconstruction could be realizing that, in fact, the Bible has no context for how we view a creation story. That could be one part of it, or it could be more serious things, right? It could be things about the inerrancy of Scripture. Is the Bible actually inerrant? And if it's not, is that a problem? And what does inerrancy mean? So it's a pretty big spectrum. But I would say a lot of people that I encounter, again, it's hard to speak in absolutes, but in general, a lot of us are just fed up with the evangelical institution. What I tell people is that a lot of us are having a crisis of theology, not a crisis of faith. A lot of people I talk to are committed to Jesus. I mean, I'm committed to Jesus, but when I look at Matthew 25, the story of the sheep and the goats, right, and those who essentially took care of the poor and clothed the naked are doing the will of the Father, and those who didn't are going to be judged. And then I look at our evangelical culture that is so focused on stuff and haze and lighting and big events and money, and the majority of our time is not spent doing that. I go, well, this is like a pretty clear thing of like, well, if Jesus says we should be doing this, but most of our time in my space was spent planning for my next, Sunday morning event on the drums or accepting the next PCO invite. Is that really matching what we're reading from Jesus. So a lot of people are just fed up with like this double standard of, evangelicalism, I found, says we're the gatekeepers, we have the gospel. And then it turns out like maybe they don't always have what they think is the gospel. I mean, I just find it very interesting in those ways. So again, we can unpack that. I know that that's some very general statements, but people that I encounter are hurt. They're frustrated. They feel like they've given so much time and energy and money to an institution that essentially either told them they're not good enough or judged them or kicked out their gay friend or is in some cases reposting Candace Owens' talking points about how George Floyd was really a criminal, and they see that and they go, "Why am I doing this? Why am I giving money and time to these institutions that really aren't even trying to be the hands and feet of Jesus in a very practical way?" So I think there's a lot there, but those are a few of the things that I think about off the top of my head.
Okay, yeah, thank you, man. And yeah, there is a lot, and you're right. As Kate rightly brought up in our episode earlier this week, there's like, if you ask a question about people in deconstruction, that umbrella is like not even flat. It's like flexing upwards, like the wind's blowing it. Like there's so much under it. It's so broad that it's hard to say, well, here are the core tenets of all of it. And I think the way that you describe it as a crisis of theology and not faith is helpful. And I think it's very helpful for people to hear. And once they see like what people are saying about things that they have, it makes sense. And
and to be transparent, some people are leaving the faith. Like they're totally
absolutely
out,
absolutely.
And frankly, given the current state of things in the evangelical church, I cannot blame them. Okay. But that's not my lane. That's not my job. That's not what I'm concerned about. My job, what I'm concerned about, what I aim for is how do we stay faithful to Jesus in a time where, in my view, the evangelical church is so far down the path of political power and really weird political ideologies, and in some ways, really, I would say, unhealthy theology. How do we reclaim the Jesus part in this? How do we stay faithful to Jesus? How do we participate in the rich tradition of critiquing, the religious leaders of our day, in our way, as Scott McKnight would put it? So, that to me is what I'm after personally. I have friends who are like, "Hey, I'm an atheist now. Hey, let's talk. I love to engage. I'm not here to save you. I'm not here to rescue them. I'm not here to convince them with my new apologetic, from some new apologist why atheism makes no sense and Christianity does." I'm over that part of my journey at this moment because I've seen it so manipulated and so twisted, that for right now, I'm like, you know what? My job is to love people. That's it. My job is to be a little Christ to people as best as possible. So I'm going to keep doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of a follow-up to trying to engage with people who are in that, there was someone on one of your posts who I asked, and they weren't even the person I asked, but they responded to it in a really deep way. I asked about accountability.
Yeah.
And, I think even in whatever church that you're a part of, and even if you're not even part of a church or you're not a believer, I feel like for a lot of people, that word is a 4-letter word. And it's something that is like that leaves a sour taste in my mouth because you had a bad experience, or because you look at it as like limiting your freedom or limiting whatever. Do you feel like accountability in any form exists in your specific new evangelical deconstruction space? And if so, what does it look like? Do you think it's even desired? What do you think?
Are you talking about like accountability from like almost like an accountability partner perspective, where it's like someone holding you accountable to faithfully walking with Jesus, something like that? Or are we talking about like holding leaders accountable?
More the former.
Okay.
More the former. Yeah.
Okay.
More of a personal relationship type. I see things that are unhealthy for you. I want to help you, like that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah. Let's just be frank, right? A lot of us who grew up in these circles have all had accountability partners. I've had accountability partners. I've had great friends in my life that at the time I said, please hold me accountable to not watch porn, whatever it is. It's always porn for the guys. And nowadays, a lot of girls too, right? So it's like, okay, so here's my phone code, here's my software, etc. But what has also happened is a lot of us have also experienced quote unquote accountability by church leaders. And as we unpack that, we realized it was more just a method of keeping us under their thumb and keeping us entrenched in volunteering for quote unquote the kingdom and giving for quote unquote the kingdom, when in reality we were just making their Sunday morning events bigger, or giving them more money so they can spend more money on more haze machines, all in the name of accountability, or whatever else it might be. So I think you have to understand that for a lot of people, for the first time, they feel like they can breathe on their own, right? For the first time, I'm 33. I am now, for the first time in my life, understanding that I am not inherently wicked and that I can trust myself, okay? Because I grew up in a Calvinist perspective that taught me that my heart is deceitful above all else. All else. Now, that's not saying that I'm not capable of bad. Of course I am. I know that. But learning that, like, maybe God made me initially good and that I can start trusting the intuition he gave me in relationship with him. That's a different dynamic than I'm bad, I'm evil, I'm wicked. Nothing I do is good unless Christ does it through me. So a lot of people are, for the first time, experiencing this, and they're like, "Whoa, okay, my training wheels are kind of off right now." So they're trying to ride the bike for the first time, okay, and it's gonna be wobbly. There's gonna be some wrong turns, and we're gonna fall over. But a lot of people, when they hear certain words like that, it triggers, right? Just like, oh my God, that means like someone in my space in the name of God, which is really just controlling me to not whatever it is, to not feel this or not to do this action, not to smoke the cigarette, whatever it might be. So I think, though, a lot of people are looking for partnership, right? For community. They're looking for wisdom. They're looking for encouragement. They are looking for opinions. But I think we have to change the language in that way, because no, I don't want an accountability partner. However, I would love to find someone, personally speaking, who's maybe a little bit ahead of me, who can offer some wisdom. I would love that. I would love to have someone I can say, hey, I have this thing in my life right now. Like, what do you think? How would you handle it? And then them trusting that whatever decision I come to, they walk with me on that, right? That's different than I think how we experience accountability growing up. So I think yes and no. No, I don't want evangelical accountability. Yes, we do want people who are in our life offering support, offering wisdom, walking with us, letting us fall down on the bike and helping us get back up, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And a lot of what you harped on is exactly why I framed it as people see that word as a four-letter word, as something that's triggering, as something that's scarring, as something that's been used as a baseball bat to shame them.
Yes. And for the record, we get about 200 DMs a day. And so I see a lot of stories, I see a lot. Now, of course, one account is not going to tell you the general, what is common. But when you combine what I'm seeing along with the data that we have, it is not unreasonable to say that a lot of people who grew up in these spaces have had things like accountability really misused to control them and not to cultivate their own sense of, humanity and even to a degree autonomy, but instead has been used to keep them under leadership's thumb, to keep them in the right mode of thinking that benefits the system, essentially.
Yeah. So, speaking of those stories and things that you see, the New Evangelicals has really taken off, and you've had a lot of interaction from people from a variety of backgrounds and experiences. And so this might be a weird question, but how is this Deconstruction Project bolstered your faith, if it has? And if it has, what does that look like? How has it done that?
Yeah, I think that it has in a whole different way, right? Like, I don't have more answers. I probably have more questions. I'm in some ways more unsure of things that I thought I would never be unsure of, but in other ways I'm more confident in things. And I think the bolstering has been that surely this is where Jesus tends to be. Like with the people who are really hurting, the people who have really gotten the wrong end of the stick, the people who have gotten the bad rep, people who have made major mistakes and are just so broken by it. Surely there's work that needs to be done, and that this is like part of that mandate. Now, I say that carefully because especially in our time, I think more than ever, everyone can kind of weaponize Jesus. Jesus was a warrior. He wasn't this. We don't need meek and mild Jesus. We need a warrior Jesus. That kind of thing. So surely I understand that anyone can kind of twist anything to be in their own image. Okay. But when I do read just the Sermon on the Mount, when I just see the life of Jesus, when we see the letters that Paul writes to the church, there is a consistent theme of just the underside, like the underbelly of the empire, and how that's where the church was birthed out of. That's where Jesus tended to be. People who were not always famous and powerful. Certainly he was with them as well, but it was always a speaking truth to power. So my faith is really bolstered in that way of like, I am truly convinced more and more that God does take sides with the oppressed and marginalized consistently throughout history, throughout the Bible, throughout, modern history, etc. And okay, how do I do my best to align myself with that side? How do I do my best to understand that empire is not a God-given thing, that God's kingdom is not an empire in the way that we might have been taught that it was. So yes, in some ways my faith is certainly bolstered. In other ways, I have a lot of questions. I'm still wrestling through a lot of things I was taught, and I have questions about the Bible, and it is what it is though. But I think the mystery is where the divine is often, and I'm learning that maybe for the first time in my life.
Yeah, I love that, man. And I actually don't see the asking questions and having your faith bolstered as two separate things. I tell my students all the time that I left seminary with 10,000 more questions than I had going into it. And it's in the dependence, it's in the asking questions and learning to ask better questions that your faith grows because your dependence grows. And that's how you really learn to walk, not with knowledge and I know the right answer, but really what faith is, an assurance of things not seen, and the hope that we have in Christ, and why we realize we do need Christ for all these things. And I love how you framed that last part of the mystery is where the divine is. You see that with Paul talking about the idea of marriage and men and women relating to one another. He's like, I'm speaking of Christ and the church, and it's a mystery. And the abstract, ethereal existence of the Spirit and moving with the Spirit, and what does that look like? And there's a lot there that's like, man, when it comes to not just like Christian faith or about God, but really anything in existence, faith is always like present somewhere, because we don't always know everything all the time, even though people who are online would tell you otherwise. But
right. Well, and that's that's kind of maybe like why this is such a big deal for us, because again, a lot of us grew up in an environment that said, no, here are the answers. Here are the absolutes, right? Here is what you need to know to not burn in hell forever, because hell's a real place and you're going to be on fire one day if you don't pray this prayer and make sure that you confess your sins to Jesus. And so for us to kind of unlearn some of this stuff, and also to realize that, like in the case of hell, there's actually several various perspectives inside the Christian tradition on hell, and that there are some pretty safe but deep and complex waters here. I think for a lot of us, initially, the idea of deconstruction, of realizing that, okay, the world's bigger than this evangelical slice of the pie, it's very anxiety inducing, because again, when you're a kid from, 0 to now, right, you're told, no, here's the truth. Here's the answer. The world has it wrong. We have to be counterculture. But you realize more and more like how much of that was really a very specific flavor of a more modern fundamentalist take on Christian thought than even Christian historical tradition would have you think. Certainly there are some, consistent themes, resurrection of Christ. Of course, I understand all that. But when it comes to these other issues that we're told, are for certain, especially the hell one and other issues too, it turns out like, it's not that black and white. It's just not. And that's okay. But a lot of us found essentially that, yes, we were encouraged to ask questions as long as we came to the right answers. And I think once we started coming to answers that the evangelical establishment, whatever you want to say, didn't like those answers, then we were deemed problematic. Once we started talking about the term social justice, oh no, that's liberal. Once we started talking about racism, oh no, that's CRT, right? Maybe hell's not forever. Oh, then why even be a Christian? All of a sudden now these thoughts are dangerous, even though you can find theologians, throughout history who advocated for things like that. I mean, the Wesleyan tradition in the, early 19th century was an abolitionist tradition. They were part of the Underground Railroad fighting for racial justice, in the name of God. So certainly this is not like crazy left-wing anything. It's actually found in our own Christian tradition. But until you start realizing that, you're just taught from the beginning that anything that essentially is quote unquote liberal is automatically bad, and most things, 99.9% of the things that are quote unquote politically conservative are good. That's how we can have Christians who claim to follow the way of a nonviolent Jesus advocate for owning more guns as being a good Christian thing to do, because we're more in line with our political ideology than we are with the crucified Jesus. So there's a lot there, but those are some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I agree. I was just I was fortunate to be on asked to be on a podcast called Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. And I loved it. Right? Yeah, it was fun. Well, I mean, Corey's a guy who's had like White House administrators and 4-star generals and ethics professors on. I'm like, you want me on? I'm not going to add anything.
Wow, seriously.
But it was a lot of fun to talk about that kind of stuff, and mainly Gen Z and Gen Alpha stuff. But yeah. You're right. And my undergrad was in political science, and so I can use it. The only way I use it today is looking at a lot of polling information, and I'm like, people don't know how to read those things, and that's about it. That's about it. And so, I often joked with people over the course of my life that it took me getting a degree in politics to finally become apathetic toward it. And but I've also had in the last year or so really good conversations with people who are in the political sphere who are like, you know what, this is the practical working out of helping people flourish, and so we should be in the political sphere, but it needs to look a lot different than kind of what you said, like completely aligning a worldly political ideology with Christian root fundamental things that are really important in our theology, and not being able to separate them and weaponizing them. Like that is something that certainly is problematic. Whichever way you would want to swing that pendulum, it is dangerous, and that's certainly not what we should be doing with our faith.
And certainly I advocate for being involved politically. I think that's good. I mean, I do. Seek the good of the city, right? We want to seek human flourishing. We absolutely do. But again, it just baffles my mind to see the evangelical movement and where it's aligned on its political stances, because I just don't understand where they get them biblically or even, orthodoxly, if that's even a word, speaking. I mean, a layup would be climate change. That's a layup. Okay. I just actually interviewed Catherine Hayhoe. She just wrote a book on this. She's like a leading climate scientist expert. She's in all the big meetings with all the big wigs. And, she's like, listen, the 95% of the scientific community agrees. And here's why we know all this. And to see Christians I follow, theologians who today, to this day, advocate for climate change being just some myth that isn't real, despite all the data and also the reality that we are called to take care of God's good planet, and instead we're destroying it with all kinds of things. We're deforesting it in the name of corporatism and all this stuff. To see so many Christians actively fight those things, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's like if you had a Ferrari and you let me borrow your Ferrari and I trashed it and gave it back to you, you wouldn't call me a good steward of that. But yet we think it's totally cool just to or we think that somehow the industrialization of the past 200 years hasn't had a significant impact on our ecosystem that's been given to us by God. So again, it's just very bizarre for me and I grew up in a talk radio household. Okay. Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin, I can name them all. I listen to them all. I still listen to them today to hear what's going on. And they push this stuff like crazy. So again, for me, it's not so much of like, oh, Christians are political. No, I'm all about that. We should be seeking the good of our city. But how they're political, it consistently baffles me. And honestly, it's one of the largest ingredients that go into the cake of a deconstructing Christian. Because, once we saw everything with Trump and how that only snowballed in the January 6th insurrection and the Jesus banners and how downplayed it was, it just continues to further our point that like something is wrong. What I tell people is that in my view, now this is just my view, okay? So I'm not holding you to it. Your audience might disagree with me, but white evangelicalism in particular, what we can say in general, American evangelicalism is really more of a right-wing political movement than it is a healthy Jesus-centered theology. And look at how they vote. Look at the issues that they advocate for. If you don't have white evangelicalism, you don't have QAnon. You don't have the election fraud being as widespread as it is. Those things are driven by that crowd. We have the data on that. I mean, you're a political scientist guy. I'm sure you've seen the Baylor study, the Pew study, the Barna Group study. They're all out there. So, that's what I think gets a lot of us so to a point of frustration and also just so baffled. We go, wait. You're telling us that Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love our neighbor and to love God, right? And we have the Sermon on the Mount. We have all these teachings of Jesus that are beautiful. And you tell me as a committed Jesus follower to go storm the Capitol in the name of God because an election was stolen when we know it wasn't. And that's your idea of loving your neighbor. I'm sorry. What is happening here? So I think that's for a lot of us where this gets very frustrating.
Yeah, no, man. Yeah. I like hearing you talk about that. And it's those dots that, it's really kind of baffling. So, man, yeah, I could talk about a lot of things, but I certainly wanted to get to this question for sure. So, yeah, I have it set up as my final question. It might not be my final question, but so you mentioned from the beginning, really, and I like how in your stories you remind people like what the point of this community is and what's happening, right? You mentioned that, along with wanting to create spaces and communities, maybe it's via Zoom, maybe it's traveling like you recently did and you got to meet with people for conversation and understanding, that you want to help reform, as it were, the evangelical church. So for you, Tim, what would you say, what would a healthy, newly reformed evangelical church look like to you? In other words, what big milestones would you share and celebrate with the new evangelical community as, look, they finally realized their misstep, their mistake, their misinterpretation? What would be on that list for you?
Yeah, I mean, listen, let's be honest. That's a great question. And this, for at least in my view, this is pretty early on. And and when I say early on, I don't mean just new evangelicals. I mean this idea in general. Okay, we're not that important. We're just one piece of the pie here. There have been a lot of people who have rethought church for our context, right? You have the missional movement, you have the emergent church movement, you have the house church movement, etc. And I think they're all great. One thing we have to realize is that the evangelical expression of church is simply a model of church. That's all it is. Models come and models go. All right. The way that Martin Luther met in his context, his model looks very different than even now how Lutherans meet. Okay. So models are going to ebb and flow. They're going to change. They're allowed to change. That's also why I tell people that when we critique the institution, we're not saying that the church is bad. The church is the hope of the world. But what we are saying is that the system that's mapped onto the church needs to be reformed and rethought and reimagined. Okay, so that's important to realize off the bat. That what we're talking about here is not the church itself. We're talking about how does the church organize? How does it gather? What does it emphasize, etc. All right. So with that all being said, this is just me kind of talking over things I thought about over the past few months and, well, longer than that. But for me, there's a couple elements. First off, right now in our evangelical spaces, most churches center their time around an event. Okay, your time is organized around the Sunday morning gathering. If you're a large church, that can include a production team, that can include a worship team, full lighting. And I come from that world. As a drummer, it's great to play in those spaces. I mean, it's a dream come true, right? But they're a lot of work. So my life was oriented around the Sunday morning event. We put on this hour long event, two or three times a morning. etc. We have to shift that from a focus on event to being centered on a community. Okay. Because the reality is, no matter how much we say we're a family or we're a community on Sunday morning, there is very little time for people to give and receive. All people can do is spectate. They come, they receive some stuff, maybe a word, they go home, check it off their list. That's not a community. Okay. So I think we have to change our focus from being event driven to community driven, meaning where are there, what do small pockets of the church meeting in neighborhoods, maybe in houses, look like consistently on a Sunday morning? And then how does that overflow to people loving their neighbor in tangible ways? I mean, tangible ways. That includes loving each other well. Now, the problem with this is that it requires something, right? Our American context is very individualistic. We all have our own schedules, and we kind of organize them in hierarchies of, okay, this is my family, so that takes priority. Then, well, what do I want to do? And then, okay, like where's my time in that, right? And the problem is people will find out very quickly that when you have a little community of people who are centered on Jesus and are meeting, you're going to have some friction because people are going to be annoying. You're going to have that one person in your group who you just don't want to see that on that Sunday morning or that Thursday night, or you don't want to invite over because they talk too much or not enough, right? So we have to be able to make space for the realization that this takes work. Okay, you don't just drop into a community in the first time and all of a sudden it's all roses. I think sometimes we kind of romanticize community. You know, that was a big church buzzword for a lot of years. It still kind of is, but for a while it was big, you know, but we really romanticized it. And once someone annoyed us or once someone said the wrong thing, now I'm not talking about abuse. I'm not talking about that. Okay,
Right.
That's all different animal. But once someone just rubbed you the wrong way, oh, they made this comment, I'm out. So we don't really know how to like stick with people and make something work for the sake of Jesus and loving our neighbor well. So I think that's what a church community should look like. I would love to see food always involved. I think there's something powerful about eating a meal together.
Amen.
I would love to see these spaces celebrate Eucharist every Sunday. I mean, that's a biblical mandate that evangelicals just right over the head. You know, so there's those kinds of things. But I certainly think consistently, I guess we could say weekly gathering with a meal, spending time with each other, making space for each other, making time to be real friends, not this church friend zone nonsense. I'm talking about like, hey, I'm going to Target. You want to go with me? Just to go, right? Again, it's easy to say that. It's harder to do it. And it takes people who are willing to put in that work and to make space and to humble themselves and to lay down their priorities for the sake of the other. Starts sounding familiar all of a sudden, doesn't it? Yeah. You know, but I think that's for me what this could look like one day. I'm not saying for new evangelicals, I don't really have a desire to become like another church thing, you know, and honestly, full transparency, I think that church planting in America is overrated. We have plenty of churches. In my small town of like 5,000 people, there's like 4 churches, you know, like in like a 1 square mile radius, there's 4 churches. And then a mile down the road, another 5. So I'm just saying like there are churches everywhere, but I do think we need people who are willing to put in the work to actually be together as a community, loving each other well. So that's kind of where I really tend to land these days.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a really good center for healthy ecclesiology. I will take this spot to shamelessly brag on our church. And so I was raised in a large Southern Baptist church. Actually, so when I was on with that Talking Politics and Religion podcast, he asked me why I'm calling myself Youth Ministry Maverick. And so I'm in Dallas. And so the Mavericks have something to do with that. I'm always going to be a Suns fan first. Sorry, everybody. But, it's so part of that. But also, when you think of the term Maverick, you think of like unconventional, outside the box. Yeah. And when I was growing up, down the street from my church lived John McCain. And he went to our church. And he still went there during the presidential campaign. And so it was a circus to try and get there. I mean, they'd block off a whole side, his own entrance in and out. No one else could do it. It was Secret Service. All the cameras were all inside of our sanctuary, listening on what my pastor would say with every word. You know, my pastor gave the closing prayer after McCain's speech at the national convention. And so like people are like watching and looking at that. And there's no politician that everyone should always agree with everything that they say, hopefully.
Sure,
But
sure.
a lot of the elements of across the aisle, a lot of that kind of stuff, things about John McCain, I really appreciated, and a lot of people in Arizona did. And so that's a whole reason. Well, that's one of the main reasons from that view why I kind of named my podcast for what I did. But as far as approaching things in a healthy way, as far as our church here, so I was always from big churches, worked in big churches, came here, we're less than 200 people. Plymouth Brethren roots.
Oh, I know Plymouth Brethren.
Really congregational.
Oh,
and
yes.
the main remnants of that is once a quarter, instead of Bible study and connection hour after church, we have our family meeting. And it's a time for us like to hear from the leadership and to have back and forth, have updates and community and all that. But what we basically function as a non-denominational Bible church now. So we're very historically rooted. Our entire service is like the historical, traditional call of worship, the message, the Eucharist every week is the climax pinnacle of the service. And then the benediction and the call to worship. We have some good liturgy. We reference from the Common Book of Prayer, from other books of prayer, corporately confess together, have assurance through our hope in Christ, all that kind of stuff. And it really, and the benefit of being part of a small church, which I really didn't understand until coming here, is that you can't be anonymous, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And that you can really engage and really know who's around. And if people look for, I feel like the consumeristic culture of especially evangelicalism, if it couldn't get farther up already, I feel like COVID made it go straight up because everyone was forced to go online. Yeah. And so now people really do, just instead of having to drive down the street and check out different churches, they can just go click, 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 and be a part of that. And, as far as welcoming people in person, if you can't connect in person, then I'm so glad that we have Zoom and this technology to do it. But it's that everything you mentioned about healthy church culture and what that looks like, and sharing a meal, in some ways, our pastor who was here about a little over a year ago, he moved to a different church up north, that he would talk about how every time you have a meal at all, or even like when you're in the pool with water, in some way, you should be reminded of the Eucharist and baptism, because of like when you take those things together and what they mean in the context of a local, I know that we are the body of Christ, but a local gathering, a local church, a local community, it's affirming to be in that, and you confirm that in there, and you celebrate with each other, and you're reminded of these elements and how they're present, and how God used them through Christ to point us to something bigger and greater. So when you're talking about those basic tenets of not being a number, being known, doing common things together, not just a handshake or a hand wave during COVID and greeting time, and then never seeing them the whole week or talking to them. Right. Yeah, you're right. That authenticity, which by the way, Gen Z, according to studies, values so much more than any other generation. Like they want to actually know that you walk what you talk, and they want to see that. And so I'm with you. That's really what churches should be looking like.
That's right. No, I feel it all the way. We'll see what happens to the evangelical movement, because right now, I don't think a lot, not again, we're speaking in broad terms, but a lot of these especially more public ones are certainly not walking the walk that they claim to talk about. And I think a lot of people, millennials, Gen Z, even older, Gen X, etc., they're sniffing that out. And they're like, nope, something is, whatever you're peddling here, like it just stinks. Yeah. And, so we'll see what happens, but yeah, it's very interesting times for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Tim, this has been great, man. I'm glad we finally got to make this happen. And I would love for people to be able to come check you guys out and see what New Evangelicals is all about. Listen to people's stories. Tell us where people can connect with you and the New Evangelicals online.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. You can follow us on Instagram at the New Evangelicals. You can follow us on Twitter at New Evangelicals. I have a podcast as well, so we're certainly out there. You can also go to thenewevangelicals.com and sign up for free to check out our map and see who's in your area, which is always cool. So yeah, there's quite a few different ways to interact, but Instagram is probably the most direct way. Most of my day is spent in the DMs, to be honest. So,
yeah, very cool, man. All right. Well, Tim, my prayer for you will be that you keep seeking Christ and keep championing that to everybody. And I love that. And that God uses you well to help bring a gospel mindset to everyone that you engage with, and to nicely tell them that they shouldn't say Daddy God because it's weird.
I received that blessing.
All right.
Thanks
you,
for your
Tim.
time, man. Yeah.
Well, that does it for today's episode. Thanks so much for watching. All the contact information and everything else our guest shared about getting to know them and their ministry more is in the YouTube video description below. If you haven't already, please give our video a like. And at the end of this video, there'll be a spot right here to watch our last video, and a spot right here to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already. Also below, there's a link to our website, youthministrymaverick.com. You can listen to all of our episodes, get some merch to help support the podcast. You can see a list of organizations that are there to help you in your ministry, see some articles that I've written, and some other things. Hope to see you back here on Friday for the next fantastic Friday 5. And until then, thanks for watching. Adios.